Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Foundations of Freedom. Episode 15. Um, this one's going to be interesting. This one is this one's about we were just talking, a very polarizing character in American history. He was a polarizing character at the time um, that he lived, but also probably still is one of the more polarizing characters in our history, especially one of the more polarizing presidents that we have had. He was the seventh president of the United States of America. We talked about him a little bit in the last podcast, our last Foundations of Freedom podcast, the Battle of the Alamo. We talked about his resolve to take back Texas and his protege, Sam Houston. Today we will discuss the legacy of Old Hickory, Mr. Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, that is, the seventh president of the United States. So, yeah, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Guys, what do you think about this? This was as always, I enjoyed the research on this one, but out of the people that we've talked about recently, I felt like personally this is one of those characters that like the Daniel Boones, everybody kind of loved him. Davy Crockett, everybody kind of loved him. We haven't talked about too many. Actually, we probably haven't talked about too many characters in American history where there are a lot of people out there to this day that still absolutely despise that person that we're about to talk about. And I feel like this is one of those. Like this is like one of those that's like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago when they're pulling down statues. Like I don't think we've covered many where they were ripping down statues of.
Yeah.
And this is probably the first.
A little bit different tune we're taking here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite the personality though. It was fun to research him.
Yeah, and it is, as much as I think a lot of people like dislike Andrew Jackson, I think you gotta like. I think I was listening to that one podcast, Jake. I think I shared it with you. I think I shared it with the group, but the guy talking was saying that whether you like him or you don't like him, you have to look at Andrew Jackson for what he was at the time. Obviously, you know, um, we live in a different age now, and a lot of the things that he did back then, looking at it through today's lens, probably wasn't the right thing to do, or wasn't the morally correct thing to do. But it was done, and whether those things, it's almost like some of those things that he did that maybe weren't great allowed America to be where it is today. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but it's yeah, the growth of the U.S. and the trajectory of the U.S. might not have been quite the same without some of the decisions that were made, you know.
Mhm.
So interesting guy.
Very.
Absolutely. I feel like you get more of a glimpse of his temperament than say a
Hmm.
Davy Crockett or a Daniel
Right.
Boone, where as interesting as those guys seem to have been, I think there's not as much certain dialogue or kind of historical
Mm,
facts that we know about them. A lot of it seems to be kind of mixed up between legend and
right.
fact, whereas
Mhm.
Jackson, I think we get a better glimpse of his personality and kind of how he went about things.
There's a lot of fact with Jackson.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
is, yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot out there. Tom, I know you got into that book a little bit. Was there anything like just initial as you were starting to read that book, like initial takeaways that you're like, oh wow, like this made Jackson a really interesting character? Before we jump in, we'll get into his early life and all that, but like just
Mhm.
initial like thoughts thinking about Jackson.
Yeah, well, they started the book off. This was from the Brian Kilmeade, and he was talking about when Jackson was in the army fighting the British, and his older brother died in that war. I don't remember which war it was or something. It was anyway. His older brother got killed, and then he and his younger brother were captured. And then one of the British officers told him to, I think, shine his shoes or something like that, and he said no. And then the officer got really mad and like striked him with his sword. And Jackson got like this big scar on his face and his hand from trying to block it. And he said that from that moment on, that Jackson completely hated the British.
Hmm.
And I think he was only like 13 when this happened. So he was a young kid. And the next part I thought was really interesting. That was kind of like showing his stubbornness, but the second thing was really sad. Well, his other brother got a disease and died, and then his mom decided to go help as a nurse for the wounded soldiers, and she got another disease and then died. So he was an orphan at 14. So, and his dad died like a few years before that. So I thought it was like pretty insane how much happened to him at such an early age. And it seemed like he kind of just took it all as like, I don't know, he like absorbed all the pain and almost used it as fuel to
Hmm.
really see what he could become, which he did quite a lot in his life. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. He was, yeah, from a young age, obviously, like that, there's exposed to a lot, kind of thrown
Yeah.
into it at a young age, and I think that definitely shaped his trajectory in life.
Mhm.
And he used it in a very positive way, but while other people might have just, you know, maybe let it affect them more negatively or
Yeah.
not had that same drive and that push, but he did, which I think shows a lot about his character,
Hmm.
the type of person he was. Um, yeah, so he was Andrew Jackson was born in the Waxhaws region. I think that's how you say it. Which was then part. Obviously, he was born in 1767, so this is before the colonies gained independence from Great Britain. So March 15th, he was born, 1767. That region was part of the British colony of South Carolina at the time. Jackson was born, and I think this is pretty important. Jackson was born to an Irish immigrant family. So we had talked about, I think it was in the Davy Crockett podcast, we had talked about the Irish Scots, that the group of immigrants that came here uh, looking for land and opportunity because basically they were like indentured servants overseas in Ireland and Scotland. So his family, his mother and father came immigrated from there and came here and settled in the colony of South Carolina. Jackson's father died. At a very young age. I think Jackson's father was 29 when he died, and Jackson was extremely young. That was in a logging accident. So, immediately, kind of early in Jackson's life, obviously he's dealing with a bit of tragedy here, and that only continues, like you said, Tom. So that left Jackson's mother, Elizabeth, with widow as a widow, and she had obviously her sons with her. Um, but I think while I think it's important to note, at least from the birthplace of Jackson, this becomes important later in his life, especially during his presidency. Um, the fact that Jackson is born in kind of what's considered the South. At that time, it's somewhat west in the colonies, and he's not born in Philadelphia or like New York. This is really important, and the other thing too is that he's not born into like the aristocratic families or anything like that, like some of the other early presidents, right? So this is something that carries importance later in Jackson's life. He comes from, Irish immigrants, more of like the common man, and so I think this is really important, and this carries a lot of importance into his presidency, and people see him as a man of the people because of this. Um, like you said, Tom, so Jackson at like the age of 13 was actually he participated in the American Revolution. So him and his brother were couriers for the Continental Army. Um, his brother Robert was his brother that was a courier with him, and then I believe he had an older brother that actually fought in the war as well. Um, he witnesses the Battle of Hanging Rock, and him and his brother are captured at that battle. And like you said, Tom, then they're kind of kept as like they're actually sent down to a POW camp in what's today Camden, or I think it was Camden, South Carolina. So they're held in this POW camp, and like you said, they're kind of mistreated there. Um, they actually both developed smallpox while they're in the POW camp.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So, and obviously smallpox at that time was a pretty big deal. If you caught smallpox, there wasn't a whole lot going for you. And so they both developed smallpox, and his brother Robert actually dies with smallpox. Andrew makes it through that, but that leaves him with one less family member. I believe his older brother that was fighting, had already passed away, fighting in the revolution. So at this point, it's basically just him and his mother. And at the same time, his mother, she volunteered as a nurse on the American POW ships. Um, and she becomes ill. It did not say what she became ill with, but obviously on those POW ships, they were pretty much rampant with all sorts of diseases, because there's dying people and injured people, and so it was like a breeding ground for disease. So she becomes ill and dies, leaving Jackson actually an orphan at 14. So he's already orphaned at 14. And like you said, Tom, I think all this tragedy early in his life creates this resolve in him, to try to do something great. I think the other thing it solidifies is we like move forward in Jackson's life. One of the things that seems to be a fairly common theme is he has some enemies, and he has these vendettas, like we talked about in the Alamo podcast. He definitely does not like Quincy Adams.
Oh,
No, he's not a fan of Quincy. So I think this maybe sparks the first vendetta or his biggest enemy. And this is obviously an enemy that stays true throughout his career as a politician. And I would say for the rest of his life, he hates the British, despises the British. And I think probably a lot of that stems from the revolution and the way he was treated. Him and his brothers were treated in the POW camp, and his mother dying and all this, right? So I assume that probably plays a big role in his vendetta against the British. Um, so after the death of his brothers and his mother during the war, he's left an orphan. Um, he works various jobs and studies in North Carolina, and he actually moves in 1784 to the Cumberland River settlement in the western part of North Carolina, which actually later becomes Tennessee, to practice law. And so this is kind of his first home in Tennessee. And this obviously it becomes infamous. If you drive through Tennessee nowadays, there's old Hickory everything in Tennessee.
Mhm.
Um, I
It's
think, yeah.
reminiscent almost of the Abe Lincoln podcast that we did, how he was kind of a like a
Hmm.
self-educated man, and then went on to practice law. I forget what they call him, like a frontier lawyer, I think is the title that both of them held.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly
So
what it
there's
was.
kind of a parallel there.
Which I want to know what it took to become a frontier lawyer. It didn't seem like it was much. I feel like
Yeah.
I could have been a frontier lawyer.
Yeah, you read a few books in high school, get your GED, and then it seems like you're good to go.
Yeah. They're like, how many books have you read? And you're like, oh, I read two. And they're like, oh, you're ahead of everybody else. So we'll call you a frontier lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe not the highest standard there.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, so he's a frontier lawyer. He's appointed, I think some of the other like titles, looking through kind of like the timeline of his life and reading about him, he was in 1788, he was appointed solicitor for the Western District of North Carolina, which I wasn't too sure what it meant to be the solicitor for the Western District. It sounded like it was some sort of early like government representation. Um, and then in 1796, when Tennessee becomes an actual, it's admitted into the Union as the 16th state, Jackson is elected the first representative for Tennessee in the House of Representatives. So he is like a very important figure in Tennessee's like reaching statehood and gaining representation in the government. So that is something to know. Tennessee people should be proud of Jackson, I guess. Depends who you are, I guess, but yeah. Did you guys have anything else from like that time period in his life? That was one that I didn't I couldn't find a whole lot on in my research, but maybe you guys dug up some interesting facts. I find the rest of
Yeah.
his life, there's a lot that goes on in like the second half of his life, but it seems like, obviously his first like 15 years played a huge impact, and then he kind of wanders off and sort of is in that like self-finding period of his life, trying to figure out what he wants to do,
I
who
feel like
he is.
that's a common theme with a lot of the figures that we've analyzed here in the previous podcasts, was
Mhm.
they all have that one period where I mean you just don't hear from them for a little bit. They kind of drop off the face of the earth for maybe 2, 3 years
Oh yeah.
before then they reemerge and the rest is history. But I did look up solicitor just because I was curious, and it's basically like the assistant to the attorney general, is
Interesting.
what I found.
Hmm.
So,
Huh. So he really tried his hand in like
like, yeah,
every
yeah,
piece of government he could. Because he
hmm
was solicitor then for the Western District of North Carolina. He was first representative of Tennessee. In 97, he resigns the Senate because, and then he serves within a year, he serves as, no, he gets appointed to the Senate from, he gets upgraded. He's House of Representatives, then he's on the Senate.
yeah,
Then he resigns and becomes actually a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court,
that's
which
right.
who let him become a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court? I'm not sure. He was probably, he was probably the only like a halfway qualified person. That's probably why they let him on.
Yeah.
So you've got solicitor, you got rep, you got Senate, you've got Supreme Court, Tennessee Supreme Court, and that's just like within, like 10 years.
hmm
Yes, that would have been like before he turned.
So
Trying to look
90,
at the
yeah, so
timeline.
90, so 98, so 98, or no, 97, he is appointed onto the Supreme Court. He was born in 67.
So he's 30.
So he's
Wow.
30 and he's already had four government positions, like state government. And this is something that's interesting to note. Because he does throughout his political career. Um, he has all these different jobs, and so I wonder too, he was especially when he became president, he was a very big proponent of state government and state government's rights. And so I wonder if a lot of that came from being in all these positions and representing a state and understanding the importance of having state government rights versus, federal, like, versus the big Fed. and big federal government. So I wonder if a lot of that stemmed from just having all those positions. It's just something I thought of actually. I hadn't thought about it until I was thinking about, oh, he's been in 4 different positions in 10 years. You think if somebody does that, they're going to have a little bit better idea of what it means to be part of state government.
Right.
And Tennessee, that was a new state at that point, right?
I mean, yeah, fresh. I mean,
Fresh.
1796, it becomes a 16th state. So,
So it's
eh,
kind of
yeah,
there at the get-go.
there at the get-go, exactly. He sees it from the start, which probably too then just leads to more understanding of local government versus federal government,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably why he was such a big proponent of that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's pretty interesting. This is something I do not know, and I was wondering if you guys knew. When was the first duel? Because there was, Jake, correct me, 13 duels? When did we hit the first duel? Was he dueling in 98, 97 when he's sitting on the Supreme Court? Is he dueling people to get on the Supreme Court?
The timelines do coincide, so
Okay.
you could say perhaps. I don't know if there's any definite documentation of that, but it's certainly possible.
Okay. Because
It was in that same timeline, like the
okay,
late
because
like towards the end of the 18th century there.
mm-hmm.
So
Because I know that one of the
yeah.
big ones was in 1802. Because so 97, he resigns U.S. Senate, becomes judge on the Supreme Court. 98, he actually marries Rachel Donaldson Robards. I think is how you say the last name. Um, their marriage later became a subject of controversy due to a misunderstanding about the legality of one of her previous marriages or something like that. And I believe that then becomes, um, I think he served on the Supreme Court in 97 through 1804. And then in 1802, so this would have been during that time that he's on the Supreme Court. This is one of the famous duels. 1802, Jackson duels Charles Dickinson over a personal dispute regarding horse racing. But not only that, Dickinson also insulted Jackson's wife, Rachel, I think due to that misunderstanding. And this is the one where he survives. He gets shot, but he survives, and the bullets lodged by his heart for the rest of his life. So that's the 1802 duel.
And
That's
the
the big
Dickinson
one.
guy he was like a renowned
Mhm.
duelist too. I know
Yeah.
he was known for
Yeah.
being one of the better marksmen
Well, he
in
he
Tennessee.
almost took him out. I mean, he put it right at the
Yeah.
heart.
But I guess to Jackson's credit, it shows he wasn't just picking on guys that, that he knew he could probably walk away from.
No, he was a little ballsy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll give
no,
him
he's
that.
ballsy. Yeah, no, he was. I mean, anybody that duels 13 or chooses to duel 13 times probably is,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's
Man, that's seems like
it's
he had
amazing. There
seems like
wasn't
he
just
had a
one
death
lucky
wish or
shot.
something.
Yeah.
I think I heard that the Dickinson could lay 4 shots on a quarter at 25 paces, 25 feet or
That's
something
pretty
like that.
impressive.
Yeah. I think
That's really impressive.
Wow.
And
he
that's what
said,
those crappy old derringers
yeah,
too.
yeah, I know. But in that video, it's kind of like a biography about Jackson. Apparently, the bullet hit his rib and it
Mm,
ricocheted.
up
So
to his
instead of, yeah, so like it would have gone into his heart if it hadn't hit that rib or something. So it was like
interesting.
quite a remarkable thing that he lived. But yeah, apparently, I think Dickinson said something really insulting to Jackson, where essentially that the only good thing Jackson ever did was marry a divorced woman or something like that. So pretty low blow, and Jackson wouldn't have it. So, um,
It makes sense. Yeah, it doesn't seem like something Jackson would have.
no.
He
So,
paid he paid dearly for it too. Dickinson did because
He did.
When I was reading the account of the duel, they said he fired the first shot. That's the
Mhm.
one that hit Jackson in the chest. And
Yeah.
by the rules of the game, because he shot first, he had to stand there and wait as Jackson got back up, recovered himself, and basically had a free shot at him. So
That's
Yeah.
pretty brutal just to
that's
stare it
pretty,
down.
yeah, just waiting for him, hoping he misses. There's
Right.
nothing you can do about it. I mean, that's wild.
No, those old time duels are crazy. I mean, just like I I mean, maybe we bring them back. Maybe it would stop a lot of these dumb personal
Yeah.
disputes.
Now it's like you just block someone's number if
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
say something like that to
Yeah.
him.
Exactly. I think people would have less problems with each other if it resulted in dueling. I think it would have to really be a big deal for people to go out there and start dueling.
Mhm. Well, it
Yeah,
is interesting.
people
Go
would
ahead,
watch what
Jake.
they say for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, I actually had a conversation last Saturday. Um, and I was actually it's actually a podcast for us. I was with Dr. Virginia, and she was talking about how like there's no such thing as like being insulted anymore.
Mm.
She was like the only real thing you have is like if someone steals material possessions, but if they insult you or call you something, there's nothing really you can do about it. And I was like, that's really interesting. So I wonder, like, yeah, if it like if there was a way to like combat the insult someone gave to you, if that would actually help
Well, the
people
people
have.
well, people are fighting each other now, like those sanctioned boxing things, at least on social media. You know? Like all
There he
right.
is.
Yep. All right, we're back. Canceled by the big tech again. They're trying to shut us down because we're talking about Andrew Jackson. Yeah, no, my comment there, I think, Tom, I think your point is completely right. I think people don't settle disputes really in any way, and there's no like recourse if somebody insults you, other than the people that get online that box. You know, I saw there's these two guys on social media platforms, like they're like into like watches. They're like watch experts, like Rolex experts or something. And they got into a duel. Okay.
Okay, so we were at
Okay.
we were at Jackson doing some
Yeah, we were talking
combat
about
sports.
Jackson's duels.
Yeah.
You were talking about like
Yeah. So
the boxing guys.
mhm. Yeah, so I was just talking about the boxing. I feel like in social media now, if somebody like insults you, you box them, and so I would say that's really the only recourse I've seen or that people take in trying. I don't know, make sure their names not been dragged through the mud, and if
Mhm.
it has been, that they come back and fight the person that's doing it to them. So yeah,
When
I don't know. It's similar, but definitely not to the extent that people were doing it at the time.
when you say boxing, do you mean actually like setting up fighting tournaments or like fighting?
Like actually, like setting up like a legit boxing like match.
Wait, really? I didn't know that
Yeah,
was a thing.
yeah. Like I'm trying to think of the most recent one I've seen. There's these two guys that are like that are like social media influencers for like watches, like Rolexes and stuff like that. One
Mhm.
guy's like a jeweler in New York City, and the other guy's like this like quote watch expert from like the UK. And apparently they were going back and forth on social media, and they finally just arranged a boxing match, and they fought each other like a
Wow,
legit like a legit boxing match with like a referee and everything. So
Wow.
that's kind of
That's
cool.
yeah, I
pretty
don't know. Yeah, I mean, hey, I mean, if you're doing it to stand up for your name, I guess whatever. And if they're both down to do it, So that's kind of it. Just kind of reminded me of that. But like other than that, yeah, I think Tom, you're right. There's not much recourse you can take if your name's been insulted. Um, so
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, I feel like there should be something more. Maybe that'd be a good. That'd be a good podcast to have. Like, how do we bring back honor in America?
hmm.
But yeah,
Yeah, it is interesting. There was definitely it seemed like back then there was, less tolerance for that type of insult.
yeah, and people I felt like were much more careful with what they said,
Right,
and if they
exactly.
if
So
they
somebody could
didn't,
just shoot
yeah, yeah,
you.
yeah,
So yeah, I think that's maybe why I think when your life's threatened, your life's in danger if you say the wrong thing. Maybe you're a little bit more careful about it.
mm-hmm, yeah. Well, were we were so that was Dickinson in 1802, and then we kind of get to his war career, right?
Yeah, exactly. So from here, Jackson transitions more into the military rather than the government. So he serves as Major General in the Tennessee Militia in the War 1812. He earns his fame really starts, I would say, when he defeats the British in the famous Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and then also battle. And so those two big wins as general in that War of 1812 really propel him into, I would say, the public eye. And from there, his fame continues to grow, and obviously he's noticed by more people, and he starts rising in the ranks and politics as well. Um, I think because of that, I think if he hadn't been such a successful figure in the War of 1812 and in those battles as a general, I don't think people would have looked at him the same, um, or looked to him to be a leader as president. So I think that success there propelled him in other areas.
Yeah, I in that biography video they're talking about the Battle of New Orleans and how I think it was 5,000 British versus 3,500 Americans. And these were the regulars from Britain that just defeated Napoleon, so they were considered like the best. And um, they were coming up, and Jackson ordered the Americans to fire, and it was like this barrage where the English lost, I believe, 2,000 men, and Americans only lost 40. So it was um, essentially the sign that America could hold its own because this was like its first decisive victory against a world empire or like a world power without the aid of another European power for them. So this was kind of like showing that America was like someone to be you know, I guess someone to be in the playing field now of like world powers. And something that was also very terrifying to all the British was that a lot of the soldiers that were on the British side were hit in the head. So, like, it was showing that the Americans were superior marksmen and that they were able to overcome the British with not only like brute force but also in skill. So that was pretty wild. That was kind of like a big turning point for a lot of um, people's minds about Americans, starting to pay them a lot more respect, at least in the the battlefield because of this victory. So
I think
That's
it's worth noting too, to Aiden's point earlier about Jackson resonating with the common man, was that prior to the Battle of New Orleans, he actually had no formal military training. So he
oh
wasn't
yeah.
like a West Pointer or anything like that. He was just a common man, which I think also kind of furthered that perception of him.
Mm. I didn't know that.
yeah,
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, because
yeah,
I was looking up, I was like, how did he go from serving on the Supreme Court, being a career lawman, to going and leading a army against the British. But yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no,
He just kind of volunteered to be Major General, basically.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that, I think that adds to that point you made earlier about him kind of resonating with the people.
hmm No, definitely. Yeah, I mean, other than his experience, I mean, he obviously served during the Revolutionary War as a courier, but there was no official experience, and he was only 13.
Mm,
So,
yeah, no strategy or any tactician type of background that he had other than that.
right, exactly. Yeah, and I mean that, and like I said, it kind of propels him moving forward. He's appointed a military governor of Florida after that, by James Monroe, who's the current president of the time. That's in 1817, after the War of 1812. And this kind of is I would say, the next sort of campaign in Jackson's in his life, because I feel like the first part of his life, from his birth and his service in the Revolutionary War and the death of his family, and then all the way through the War of 1812, his primary focus really seems to be on the British. And then after he's appointed military governor in 1817, his focus shifts a little bit, and um, in 1818, Jackson actually, as military governor, he invades what's at the time, I think, Spanish-owned Florida. It's still owned by Spain. In pursuit of Seminole Indians, and some British citizens. And so he goes into the Spanish territory to chase down these two British citizens, and he executes them, and then also, to chase down these Seminole Indians, basically like bring them to justice. Because it was my understanding that the Seminole Indians at the time were working alongside the British. So this creates like a bunch of diplomatic tensions between the U.S., Spain, because obviously when you've got, Andrew Jackson running around Florida, it doesn't look that great. And then you've got obviously Britain. So this causes some diplomatic tensions there. So this is actually considered, while he's in Florida tracking down Seminole Indians and um, the British, and fighting and trying to, kind of exterminate them a little bit. This is known as the First Seminole War. There's two Seminole Wars, but this is the First Seminole War. Um, and I think this is interesting because I think throughout his entire career, Jackson is at constant odds with two main enemies, it seems like. One's the British, like we talked about, but the second's Native Americans.
Mm.
And this is the first time we see that really kind of play out, from like a actual, like military standpoint. It seems like he's at throughout the rest of his career, he is at constant odds, um, with either the British or the Native Americans. And there's one other one we'll get to a little bit later, but that's less of a physical conflict and it's more of like a policy conflict that he encounters. Um, so in 1819, so this is at the end of the First Seminole War, Jackson negotiates, a treaty with Spain, This is the Transcontinental Treaty, and the treaty basically gives Florida to the United States. So we take over
Oh,
Florida from Spain. So this treaty was negotiated, we gained Florida out of the deal. So that's a pretty big deal. So Jackson negotiates this deal, um, which really only happened because he went to go kill British in Florida, along with some Seminole Indians. And then out of the deal, he just says, while we're down here, well, we've already pissed off the Spanish, the British, so we'll just take Florida, I guess. I don't know how that all happened, but I mean, I think again, it just shows like when he wanted things, he went after it a lot, like the whole Texas situation we talked about in the last podcast. But no, I thought that was pretty funny. He just goes down there and takes it within like a year. Another interesting, like important from like a geography standpoint, Jackson settles the bluffs of what is modern day Memphis, Tennessee, along the wide kind of this area of the Mississippi that was one of the widest parts of the Mississippi. So it's along the bluffs of the Mississippi. So he settles there, and he does call that home after this time, after he's down in Florida for a while, and he's there with John Overton and James Winchester, and the three of them actually found the city of modern day Memphis. So they were the three founders of Memphis, Tennessee.
oh,
So that's pretty interesting. Another another very important piece of the history books for Tennessee, but also the U.S. But um, again, a lot of early Tennessee history is owed to Jackson.
that's pretty incredible. Like to get Florida and then start a city right afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
This guy was
Oh,
on a
yeah.
roll.
Yeah, he did quite a bit. He did quite a bit, and it just seems to keep going. Um, in 1821, he serves on one of the commissions responsible for drafting the Constitution of the state of Missouri as well. Um, in 1823, he's elected U.S. Senate again. Um, but then, every time he gets appointed to the Senate, he actually resigns. So he resigns less than a year later to concentrate on his presidential campaign. And then he runs in the presidential campaign of 1824. Um, this is a pretty contentious election, from my understanding. It was actually decided by the House of Representatives. Um, Jackson, like I said, he decides that he wants to focus on running for the presidency. He's in the Senate. He, at the time, the Federalist Party, which was one of the main parties early on in American history, had collapsed. So there was, in this election in 1824, there was four major contenders from actually the Democratic Republican Party. So there's William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, I should say. And Jackson was intended to be kind of like this like a dark horse candidate to prevent Tennessee's electoral votes from going to Crawford. But then Jackson unexpectedly becomes very, very popular, and gains a lot of support outside of Tennessee. So then he becomes an actual serious candidate in the 1824 election. Um, but um, ultimately he loses to John Quincy Adams, which as we discussed in one of the previous podcasts, he really hated John Quincy Adams. But I think the important thing to note about the 1824 election is the reason he garnered so much support in the popular vote was because of his service in the War of 1812, but also because he was sort of promoted, like we've talked about, as this outsider from the aristocratic sort of leaders that we had as presidents so far. And he stood for the people, all people, the common man. And also he blamed the federal banks for the country's economic issues. So he was very in line with he had a lot of enemies that were kind of the aristocratic politicians, and he really did represent the common American man, and so that's why he gained all this support in this 1824 election. Did you guys have anything to add to that?
Um, no, that was pretty cool. Um I heard a little bit about the contention, but I didn't realize um how intense it was. That was really cool to learn about.
Yeah, I mean it it went all the way to it was decided by the House of Representatives. So it was a pretty tight election. I think actually Jackson in that did win the popular vote. I could be wrong on that, but I
Yes.
think he actually did win the popular vote.
Yeah.
And then it had to go to the House, and then Quincy pulled it off. And like I said, I think that was one of the reasons Jackson hated him so much, to be honest. Not to mention he did represent the very like aristocratic um, political leader.
Was it in Adams' presidency that he loses Texas? Do you know?
So he negotiates. Adams negotiates Texas earlier than that because that's part of. So Texas was supposed to be a part of the Texas territory was, or Jackson thought it was supposed to be part of the Louisiana Purchase.
Hmm.
Um, which what year was the Louisiana Purchase? Remind me on that. But I Quincy Adams is kind of left in charge of that negotiation. It falls through. Um,
Okay.
so it is on him, and it happens in that time range. And then so that would have been right after the War of, is that right before or right after the War of 1812? I always forget.
It looks like it was before.
Was that 1805?
1803 is what I'm
1803.
saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay, so that's quite a
Yeah,
bit earlier.
before that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they already hated each other, and then obviously they face off in this, and then Jackson really hates him after this.
Yeah,
Um,
to know that you actually won the popular vote too, and
mhm.
still, but seeing the other guy in there, that had to
Yeah.
be for someone like him, especially, had to
Especially
be
for somebody like
infuriating.
him. Yeah, no. And so I mean, that's why, the next 4 years are dedicated he really dedicates it to run again. Quincy Adams is obviously the sixth president. He serves for one term. 1828 is the next election. Jackson beats Quincy Adams in a rematch. Jackson's elected the seventh president of the United States. Pretty big deal. Like we've said, he's the first president that represents a non sort of this he represents the Western United States, the colonies, and this is important because this is where all the growth is happening in the US at this point. This is where a lot of people are immigrating to. So he represents those people rather than the last six presidents before him were more of these aristocratic, sitting in Washington, in Philadelphia, and New York, right? And or even Virginia's sort of. I mean, it's somewhat south, but it's still along that like eastern coastline. Um, so he really is the representative of the people at this point. And obviously he serves two terms as president. And during his presidency, we've already mentioned his more sort of physical battles and physical enemies, which would have been the British and the American Indians. But during his time as president, he focuses on two main policies, and one is the continued battle with the Native Americans. And one of the big controversial things he does as president is the removal of Native Americans from land. And then also the other big policy thing that he does during his presidency is his war on the federal banks. So those are the two big policy things. And the war on the federal banks is like the federal banks are his third big enemy. So it was first the British, then it turned towards the Native Americans, and then obviously the federal banks. So that's his presidency. That's sort of the legacy he tries to build, or the things he tries to do over those 8 years. And his first term is the big one. This is the one that everybody hates. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. And this led to a forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to the Indian Territory, which is like present day Oklahoma. So this policy ultimately results, in the Trail of Tears. So this wasn't like something, from my understanding, this was like a highly contentious piece of legislator, highly controversial. It only passes the House of Representatives by 4 votes. So it barely squeaks through. I think, and I think that we dig into this a little bit, guys. I think that a lot of the people that voted for the Indian Removal Act thought it was just because there was supposed to be compensation for the Native Americans for their land. So I think that's why a lot of people did vote for it. But I think ultimately the big drivers for this bill, like Jackson, put this bill through because they saw the Native Americans as in the way of westward expansion and America's development as a country. And they were just getting in the way. They were kind of cumbersome for westward expansion and the growth of the nation. Obviously, on the other side of this, the people that were against it, I mean, Daniel Boone was opposed to this.
Davy Crockett was, right?
Davy Crockett, yeah. Sorry, Davy Crockett, not Daniel Boone. Davy Crockett was against this. One of the big groups that was not a fan of this was actually Northern religious groups. They highly opposed, and people that were involved in kind of the northern, northeastern religious groups, they thought that they said it represented a sort of imperialism and greed of the American elite and the American government to remove people from their land without sort of just compensation, or forcing them off their land, even with compensation. And this went against the individual rights of a person. Jackson's response to this was that the people in opposition in the North and the Northeast had already removed American tribes from their land. So it was pretty hypocritical for them to oppose removal in the South and the West, where expansion was needed. And a lot of this had to do with, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but it seemed like a lot of this had to do with there was a lot of back and forth about this new land to be settled. Would they be slave owning states? Or could you own slaves in these new territories? And that brought up a lot of contention. So, and that would have, I think the worry was that there was already a lot of abolitionists, right? And so if you had this westward expansion where you had these regions that you could own states, it would throw off the balance of slave owning states to non-slave owning states. So I think this became a big, not only political issue, but religious issue that was looked at.
That's
But
interesting. I can kind of see the groundwork getting laid then for the Civil War too.
The Civil War.
All the boundaries and everything are starting to take shape.
Yeah, you actually you see a lot of it this early on in 1830. I do see where like the religious groups in the North had a point that just pushing people off their native land for the sake of the good of the growth of the country sort of did represent this sort of, or it represented this sort of imperialism of the U.S. government. And so I really do see that point. Because if you look at it in today's standards, I mean, if we were pushed off our property because the government wanted to do something with it, that's not really seen as something that goes along with our constitutional rights. Um, so I see both sides of it, and I do see the other side of it where, would we be where we're at today without this westward expansion? I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's tough because it's a little bit of a double-edged sword there.
Yeah, it's just like it's another example of how history is complicated. It's
Mhm. Either way,
more rare than you think to find a black and white situation where there's a
right?
clear good versus evil scenario. It's
Yeah,
not
no,
usually as simple as that.
definitely. Um, I was thinking about this a lot, and I'm kind of curious to get your guys' thoughts. But I think the decision to give the federal government this ability to seize land, because up until this point, the reason it hadn't been done already is because the U.S. government didn't have the military power to go in and seize land from the Native American tribes, right? But also because there was no sort of legal there was no legislation that allowed the US government to do this. So this is the legislation that then gave the precedent in the future to do this, right? So I think on Jackson's part, for somebody that was so adamant about states' rights and the common man, I think it's a pretty, and I think a lot of it was blinded by his drive or his not so fondness, let's say, of the Native American peoples. But I think it sort of blinded him to this decision, giving the federal government this precedent to seize land when necessary. Um, because I don't think this was the last time in American history that, and I think it still does kind of give precedent here, like for the federal government to come in and supersede individual rights when it's for the greater good of the country, right? And seize land. Because like even if you look at I think I forget, I know when we were covering the in the news stuff, do you remember when there was that train derailment
Mhm.
in Ohio?
Yeah.
Well, even today, the government can come in and seize land if it's deemed a biological hazard or if there's something like that, right? So they can come in and kick you off your property if they deem it to be a biological hazard. I know that was like in the talks when that train derailment happened. So that sort of precedent was set early on here. So I don't know. I think I think it was a little short-sighted. I think it was on his part. I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but I feel
Yeah.
like
I
I feel
I
like
agree.
neglecting individuals' rights is, even if it was a group of people that he didn't necessarily like, still probably not the best thing. Because like even I would say even after this, because of that too, you see ethnic or even religious groups mistreated by the federal government. And their religious rights. I mean, even as like the Irish immigrants were mistreated. Even when a lot of the Chinese immigrated here, and they were mistreated after during the railroad building and all this. But yeah, or even just religious rights today. I think giving the government the ability to or take away the individual's rights, um, not a good thing.
You mentioned that about the Irish immigrants being mistreated. It reminds me of that scene from Blazing Saddles where they pick all the African Americans, say, but not like anyone but the Irish.
Yeah, yeah,
It's kind of like that. But
yeah.
no, yeah, I agree with you on kind of the precedent that it set. How you brought up like the train derailment, how they can go in and take land. The
Right.
government can if they deem
And
it. And
it's obviously sneakier now. They're not
right.
just running around taking away people's land,
Well,
but
even
like,
and they still have like eminent domain too, where
right,
they're
exactly.
entitled to take someone's property if
Hmm.
they deem it to be better suited for quote unquote public use.
Right,
Um,
exactly. For
and like
it's the whole greater good
right,
cause
right,
there. It's
yeah,
man, it gets really
hmm,
it's a slippery slope. It's a really slippery slope.
exactly.
And I mean, again, I see both sides of it. I see the side and I see the argument. If Jackson wouldn't have done this and Western expansion wouldn't have happened as quickly, would we be where we're at today? Who knows, right? But like at the same time, I'm never a fan of just giving the federal government more power, especially when
Yeah,
it comes to superseding individuals' rights. And like again, for somebody that was so adamant about individual and state rights, massive oversight in my opinion. Just insane. And like
hmm,
to see like what that has caused, like the rifts in and even like today, like on the Indian reservations and all this, all the issues that it has caused, the long-standing issues that it's caused, massive. Um, so yeah, it's yeah, this is and it's one of those things that I think a lot of people spend a lot of time on. Obviously, he gets a lot of flack for it. You got to look at both sides of it, obviously. But my opinion, I tend to lean more towards the individual rights side of this and just look at it like, might not have been the best way to handle this situation.
yeah. Nah, maybe not one of his finer moments,
Hmm.
but yeah, I guess you could say that for most prominent historical figures. It's
Right.
tough to find someone who did everything right.
Especially during like this early time period, because so much is
Yeah.
different from like the fabric of society and the things that were okay back then definitely are
Mhm.
very different from what's okay now.
Mhm.
Um, so that is another important thing to note here. Um, but yeah. Um, and then in 1832, he sort of goes into this next big battle, so to speak. This is actually in his second term. He's reelected in his second term, and the renewal of the federal banks is up at this point, and he vetoes the renewal of the federal banks.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so he vetoes the renewal of the federal banks. And I actually think he had the right intentions here. He really did have the right intentions here. I think again, like his execution on this maybe wasn't flawless. I think, his heart was in the right place. Getting rid of the federal banks and his hatred for the federal banks probably was in the right place because I think he was trying to go back to something like Jefferson
Hmm.
kind of had in mind, right? But so his view on the federal banks was they helped the rich get rich and the poor got poor, stayed poor basically in the country. It didn't help them in any ways. And I think this is a view many Americans still have in the federal banks today, right? But when the federal banks came up for renewal, he vetoes them. Um, and what this did is it gave the small mom and pop banks essentially the ability to do whatever they liked. And the only problem with that is it caused a big speculative bubble, which grew during his presidency, and then actually ended up this bubble burst after his presidency. Um, and this actually caused a bit of a recession. Um, during Van Buren's presidency, and it actually cost Van Buren his second term as president because of how bad the economy got. And this wasn't an issue caused by Van Buren; it was actually because of the speculative bubble that happened because the mom and pop banks were basically running around doing whatever they wanted to for 4 years.
Wow.
Which, yeah, so another like thing here too. I thought that was like pretty interesting. Like obviously Hart was in the right place here, getting rid of the federal banks, but at the same time, execution, the actual like foresight to see like what needed to be done to make this happen. And I wonder too if there just wasn't he didn't have the right people around him supporting him and trying to make a path, um, a future path without the federal banks. I think that might have been part of it too. Um, I don't know. It's kind of interesting to read about and hear about.
Yeah. Yeah. It just shows how also how long it can take for your, especially as like a large political figure like him,
Mhm.
your the consequences of your actions could materialize only well after you're out of the out of the spotlight, as we
Right,
kind of
right,
continue to see to this day.
right. No, exactly. Yeah. And I think because of the failure for that removal of the federal banks in that time period, I think it only because it caused that recession, I think it only emboldened the people that were pro federal bank in the future to bring back the Fed and grow the Fed to the point that we're at today.
Mm.
And I think that was one of the major issues because it sort of proved their point right that the federal banks were necessary for America because of this recession and all that. So, um, yeah, that was a tough one. It's a tough one to read about because like you saw his vision, you saw his vision for what he was trying to do, and then the execution was just not there. And you're like, shoot, I wish that would have worked out. But yeah, after that, I mean, so the Second Seminole War takes place during Jackson's presidency. Seminole Indians are crushed in that second war, basically. Um, that's between 1835 and 1842. 1830, so that war actually didn't end during his presidency, but it started during his presidency. 1837, Jackson's second term ends. He goes back to his plantation, the Hermitage, which is near Nashville, Tennessee. Um, and then he dies actually 8 years later of congestive heart failure at the age of 78. Um, and he's actually buried alongside his wife, Rachel, who died in 1828. Um, and that is the life of Andrew Jackson. Did I miss anything?
Mm. I feel like you hit most of the major parts.
I feel like towards like there was his life kind of went in these streaks. Like you had the beginning, you had some of the stuff that happened in the middle, and then you had his presidential policies. There's kind of those three main areas. It's like Jackson early life, Jackson the general, Jackson the president.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I mean overall very interesting character in American history. And like I said, very like polarizing. Like most people either really love what he did or really hate what he did. And I would, the podcast, like I mentioned, the podcast I listened to at the beginning, the gentleman said, you either love him or hate him. I think you could see looking, if you dig in deep like we did, I think you can kind of pick apart some of the things he did and see both sides of it if you're objective about it. Like his policies with the federal banks. But again, I guess some people are pro-Fed and just say he was an idiot for trying to remove the Fed. But, I mean, I think if you look at things objectively, you can see what he was trying to do, and sort of the positives and the negatives. And I would say his
Yeah.
presidency was a success in the fact that it broke the norm of having sort of this very aristocratic type president in the White House.
Hmm.
Um, I think that was good then, and it set the tone that the common man could become president, and the
Yeah,
American people felt represented.
definitely. Yeah, and I did like his kind of tenacity in the White House. Like he
Hmm.
didn't like people to push him around.
Hmm.
And he tried, he wasn't too successful, but he did try to swap a lot of people out of the government while he was in there to try to bring in new blood, more of the common man rather than the
Right.
aristocracy.
Yeah, and that was another thing too. He kind of set the precedent for is and we see this today when a president gets elected into office, he sort of brings his cabinet with him, right?
Hmm.
That was something that was then set by Jackson because Jackson's like, all these people are been in here forever. Like, we need different people in here. So that was good. He was like one of two presidents. I think the other one might have been, shoot, I don't remember. Clinton, maybe. That was it Clinton? I forget who else threw basically a party and just let like everybody into the
Oh,
White House.
yeah.
And so he let everybody into the White House and they just kind of trashed it. Um, because it was just like a bunch of like hillbillies.
Yeah.
And people were a little pissed off about that, but oh well.
Sure, it
That's
was a
pretty,
good time.
yeah, I'm sure it was a good time. I'm sure there was a lot of people having fun. Um, yeah. So I think those were like I think outstanding positives is like obviously his tenacity, his representation of the common man in American government as a whole, not just presidency, but showing that the common man could do all of this in both military and government. Um, but it came along with the negatives. He left the White House with pretty tense relations with Native Americans.
Hmm.
Just between the U.S. government and Native Americans, that kind of, I mean, didn't really go away ever. Um, Displaced the Native American community. Um, didn't leave the economy in a great spot well, it was in a good spot when he left, and then it kind of fell apart later. Um, but yeah, I think yeah, and some of those decisions, I would say the negatives were he made decisions. I think he went off his gut, but his gut was very short-sighted often.
Mm, that's a good way to put
And
it.
I think a lot of that shows like obviously he was like he made decisions very quickly. I think that shows in the all the duels he had. He was a man that acted on emotion, and I think he would see it through to the point where he completed the task, but didn't necessarily have a vision for the future. So I think that was
Mm,
maybe the problem with him um, as a leader. There wasn't a clear vision into like what will this do 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road. Because a lot of the things we talked about today, you start hearing about and you're like, this sounds like a lead up to like a lot of tension to a civil war. So
mhm.
that would be my critique of him. But very interesting character.
Yeah. And hindsight's 2020.
And
So like
hindsight's
a
2020.
lot of
So
that
what?
stuff might have seemed
Yeah,
like good ideas. Like the Fed,
exactly.
for example, getting rid of that may have seemed like a genius idea to him and his advisors, but it
Right.
wasn't like we don't have the information or the
That
amount of
they had.
information circulating now, or
Hmm.
they didn't have it back then. Like you
Right.
didn't have complex financial Excel models that he'd be running now, trying to figure out if that's a scenario that
Mhm.
could be feasible. So,
Absolutely.
and
Mhm.
it was such a new country at that point, relatively speaking, with a new
Right.
form of government. So it really all a lot of it. Maybe it was a good thing that he tried it then,
Yeah. Now.
as opposed to
Yeah.
later on before the financial system grew to the extent that it did, or to
Hmm.
that it has to the present day.
Yeah. I mean, he was a gunslinger
Mhm.
in real life and his political career. He wasn't afraid to make decisions, and sometimes I think you need those people, and it had a lot of positive effects. Like Western expansion
Mm.
would not have been the same.
Yeah, I wouldn't have
It
had
wouldn't have.
Texas,
Texas,
Florida.
Florida, and just that
Missouri.
push,
Yeah.
yeah, Missouri, that push, that drive to keep developing
Hmm.
and settling. So that's a very important note to make. Because he was very representative uh of, I think he's probably one of the more prolific figures in America, like from the presidential side, other than Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase.
Hmm.
So, but it was Jackson that really made sure that we followed through on, like, the purchase was made, but then developing the land that we purchased and settling it, I think was really
Right.
kickstarted with Jackson. So yeah, I mean, super interesting. We'll have to think about who we want to
Yeah,
talk about next, but this was a fun one.
This
this
was a good one.
was.
Yeah.
It was good. This was really
Yeah.
good. Any any last thoughts before we close this one out, guys?
Hmm. I don't know. Or maybe one thing was interesting from that biography was talking a lot about how they tried to like really slander him while he
Hmm.
was running for president, trying to make him look like the opposite of what he was running on, which was
Yeah.
like trying to eliminate the corruption from the federal government because he wanted the federal government, but he didn't want it to be corrupted. So they kind of drug his name and his wife's name through the dirt. And they think that's the reason why his wife died actually, was because she couldn't
Hmm.
handle all of the insults.
Wow.
Um, so that was pretty interesting that he had the fortitude to get through all of that and then still be the president. Um, and it sounded like the guy that ran the Federal Reserve. It was a private company that held all of the U.S. treasuries.
Hmm.
And so essentially, uh, uh, Jackson was trying to bankrupt that guy to put him out of business. And he succeeded, but boy, did he make enemies with that. So I guess it was interesting that once he set his mind to it, he got it done, which I think was pretty admirable, even with so much, I guess, slander going his way. But
Hmm.
I just thought it was interesting to see that. But
That's actually really, I didn't realize that. That's pretty interesting and pretty cool.
yeah, yeah, they came up with like the all sorts of really messed up stories about his past and like trying to make him look like this really bad guy and his wife is kind of like a prostitute and stuff. And he was like, that's not really what happened. Just some divorce papers weren't finalized.
That's
So,
crazy.
yeah,
Wow.
crazy stuff.
Yeah. Definitely definitely, I think one of the most robust characters that's ever been a president.
For sure.
He's up there. He's up there.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
They should make a movie about him.
I would actually probably watch that. That'd be a pretty interesting movie.
Hmm.
Who would play him? Like who would be a good I'm trying to think.
Mm,
Well, we'll think about it. We'll propose it.
yeah.
Harrison Ford.
That'd be a good one.
Yeah. If Harrison Ford was a little bit younger, I could see
Yeah,
that.
they probably still
Harrison
won't know.
Ford's getting to like grandpa, like great grandpa age now.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. That's a good one. That's a good question.
a Russell Crowe, maybe.
Oh yeah, maybe like a
Mm,
Russell
could see
Crowe or
it.
something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
could see that. I could see that. Yeah. Somebody that's been in a Western movie, maybe.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that.
Maybe like
You
a
need like
Daniel
the you,
Day-Lewis.
yeah, you need like a cowboyish,
Mhm.
cowboy-esque person to play him, I feel like. A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it'd be an interesting movie. It'd be an interesting movie. But
Hmm.
well, cool guys. Well, thanks to everybody who tuned into this week's conversation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. It was a fun one to research, and we'll be doing another one soon. We've got a lot more ideas here, so it's just picking the one we want to focus on. But if you liked this episode, drop us a like, leave us a comment, a review. Leave us a review on Spotify if you want to. It's cool to see. Um, if this is your first time listening and you liked what you heard, you can go give us a follow at the Green Dragon Podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and True Social, and the Green Dragon Pod on Rumble and X. You can also listen to the show everywhere you go, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. For these Foundations of Freedom episodes, we do about one every 3 weeks. So you can look out for those once about every 3 weeks. Uh, the titles will always have Foundations of Freedom in the title. And we always focus on either a point in time in American history or a historical figure, um, like we did today. But until next time, be safe, fight for what you believe in, and most importantly, be a good American. God bless.